Welcome to the Mariah Gene Fit YouTube channel. I'm Coach Mariah. Make sure you like our videos, subscribe to our channel, and share our videos as much as possible so we can reach a broader audience. We appreciate your support and enjoy the video. Hello and welcome to another vlog on YouTube and podcast on Spotify by the Fit Minds podcast. Coach Mariah here. So today I'm going to dive into the topic of the female menstrual cycle and how it impacts our training and our nutrition, but also our mentality and where we are in our headspace depending on where we are in our cycle. Now, this has been a much requested topic from my female following specifically, but I would like to note that for men, it might actually be quite handy to listen to this podcast so that you are able to really understand how women operate and that we have such a diverse selection of hormones across the cycle that we have, and it will differ from female to female as to the different types of symptoms they might experience across their cycle. Funnily enough though, many women don't actually understand their cycle fully, or even where the optimal times are for them to train at their best and when they might need to deload and the like. Also things like their nutritional changes that they might need to make and considerations to things like their sleep around different times of their cycle. So it's not common knowledge. It isn't something that we discuss a lot as women, and certainly used to be a rather taboo topic. We found that possibly prior to doing further research, probably actually quite recent to be completely honest, that we didn't really understand the effects of things like exercise or over-exercise, not exercising enough on the female cycle, and also understanding things like a missing cycle in correlation to exercise and nutrition. So today I'm specifically going to focus on the very important topics that I like to cover. There is obviously so much to know about the female cycle, but I like to get really nitty-gritty down to the core of what it really means to understand your cycle. And then obviously there will be some other things that I will not cover in today's podcast because it could go on forever. So first of all, I want to talk about the different phases of a female cycle. And funnily enough, because we have a lot of women on hormonal birth control in the way of things like the pill and the Mirena IUD, we are somewhat masking things that happen during our natural cycle. And as a result, we end up being a little bit confused as to what is actually happening underneath that birth control. So to give you an idea of the differences between obviously somebody who is on birth control, and I mean specifically hormonal birth control, versus somebody who is not, you will have a clear indication of what is happening in a female's cycle who is not on birth control, simply because you do not have the synthetic hormonal influence of birth control. Now, birth control can come in lots of different forms. There are non-hormonal birth control methods that you can use in the way of things like the old-fashioned condom, which we know has around a 98% accuracy. Sometimes some will say 97% accuracy. There is also obviously the copper IUD, which is a non-hormonal version of birth control, which can be inserted much the same as the Mirena. But you do have things like the pill and the Mirena, and things like the bar as well, and even depot injections, which seem to all actually fall along the same kind of scale of what they do for the female cycle and how they suppress ovulation. You cannot get pregnant, hopefully, on birth control. But again, 99% accuracy. Some of them have limited and lower accuracy depending on individual to individual. So in the way of those who are not on birth control, we have a better indication of what is happening in their cycle, simply because that is obviously following their natural hormonal changes, and you have the natural menses. Now, it's a common misconception that when on birth control, such as the pill or the Mirena, or even the bar, that the bleeds that you are getting are actually your standard menses. And that's probably the first thing I want to cover in this discussion. It is not an actual menstrual cycle. So when you have a bleed on any form of hormonal birth control, that is what's called a withdrawal bleed. Now, sometimes you can get spotting in between, which is not a full menstrual cycle, and that can get a little bit confusing as well. That's usually sometimes your body's response to that birth control. One thing I will say as an allied health professional is that if you do find that you are not feeling very good on certain types of birth control, or you are having prolonged bleeding, whether it's taking a little while to settle and it's just not happening, it's just not settling for you, please go back to your GP and consult a different method that might be working for you a little better than maybe some of the others. Now, I'm not myself on birth control. I really don't have any sort of good experiences with birth control myself. That doesn't mean to say that I recommend going off birth control for everybody listening to this podcast. It's very different from individual to individual. Some people find that they actually reduce symptoms of things like chronic pain when they're on birth control with certain conditions such as endometriosis and PCOS and adenomyosis, which is the condition that I suffer with. But others also find that birth control either helps their moods or even sometimes in the opposite direction doesn't help their moods, and they actually end up struggling with things like anxiety, depression, etc., etc. So it's all very normal to experience these types of symptoms on or off birth control. And whether or not they're directly related or correlated really depends on, again, from individual to individual. And most of you will understand that if you listen to your bodies, more than likely you will be able to find out what does work for you. Obviously, as I said, from person to person it will completely differ because you're looking at things like, and I'll use as an example, some people are allergic to seafood and some people love eating seafood and it will never harm them. So it's very similar with our hormonal profiles. As women, we have very different hormonal profiles. And even when we do have a natural occurring cycle, there are obviously lots of different things that can happen whereby some women can have irregular cycles, and that might look like oligomenorrhea. It might look like dysmenorrhea, which is quite painful cycles, and then you've got also amenorrhea, which is when you've got usually less than 6 to 9 cycles per year. Now that's obviously referring to menstrual bleeds. In this case, you can see that sometimes women have prolonged periods of time between natural menstrual cycles. Now, this is not in reference to anyone on birth control because, again, that's not going to give us a clear indication of what's actually occurring with your cycle. Now that we know the pill bleed and the Mirena bleeds and the bar bleeds are not necessarily aligned with your natural cycle, this means that we can kind of rule that out as anything that can indicate what's happening for you from a perspective of how regular your cycle is, okay? So I'm going to focus on those who may have their cycle and are not on any sort of hormonal birth control, perhaps using condoms, maybe perhaps using a copper IUD or simple abstinence from sexual intercourse. So in the case where you do have a cycle that is present, you've got irregular periods, and this is obviously in the case of amenorrhea or even oligomenorrhea when it's like certainly quite short or quite long in length, and that would be considered anywhere from, say, maybe 1 to 2 days in length and anywhere from 8 to 9, 10 days in length. So that's when you've kind of got very short periods or very long periods, and dysmenorrhea being quite painful. And painful, it basically means that you're not able to really move for the day. Things like getting referral pain down your legs and your sciatic nerve, and certainly there's that heavy bleeding as well, which can come into play with significant pain, hip pain and back pain, which again is something that I experience with my chronic condition, but I'll talk a little bit about this later in how you can manage that with foods that you can choose to help out with those types of symptoms. So when you have this, whether it be a prolonged period of time between your cycles, it would be considered, and I think a lot of women really freak out about this, and they think that, as soon as they are late for their cycle and they get one every 28 days, and that's actually a unicorn cycle. So in the way of allied health, we always see that someone with a 28-day cycle is considered to be a unicorn. It's, yes, referenced as 28 days in length for each cycle, so just short of a typical month for each female. But this will again differ from female to female. And so you might find that one cycle you might be 25 days apart, another cycle you might be 35 days apart. When you want to pay attention to this type of difference is when it kind of is more than a week between the different times apart. So let's say, for example, you've got 25 and 35 days in the two different cycles. You probably need to have that checked out and see why maybe you've had a particularly shorter cycle and a particularly longer cycle, and that's the length between the start of your last menses and your next menses. And menses is in reference to your bleed week. So now we kind of understand what menses means as well. I am sorry if I throw out some terms in here that you're not quite familiar with, but please feel free to research them in some medical journals if you would like. Otherwise, you can chat to me about it individually as well. So if we're looking at cycle irregularity, we want to see that obviously if we have a regular cycle, that hopefully we're getting fairly semi-regular periods. No, they do not have to be, 25 days, 25 days, 25 days between. You do not have to have them to be, if say, for example, mine are usually between 35 and 37 days if I have a consistent cycle. If I don't, it tends to go much above that. So I will see them being 45 days, and even sometimes I did have a period of time there where I went 9 months without one. Now, I will reference why this happens after I've finished discussing the different cycle lengths. So obviously if you have these signs of oligomenorrhea, which is a difficult one to say, but where you have these differing cycle lengths, and certainly the length between the cycles that occur, so the menses, and also the length of the actual menses themselves, that's when you've really got to think about maybe there might be something happening underneath with either your hormones or certainly some sort of chronic condition. So chronic conditions that seem to be pretty prevalent in the way of cycles are things like your PCOS, which is polycystic ovary syndrome, endometriosis, and adenomyosis, which is not as commonly known. Now, there are other conditions, obviously, such as certain types of cancer, which we don't want to talk too much about because, we'd be hopeful that we're getting our checkups, but also obviously in consideration to other sexual diseases and things like commonly contracted HPV virus, which is usually in the way of cervical. But obviously not related to the cycle. It's just important to understand that as women, we must be getting our checkups as regularly as possible, and pap smears every, I believe it is 2 to 3 years, but certainly more regularly for those who are, they do have some sort of ongoing condition, whether it be HPV that they've tested positive for. And certainly in the way of things like scans, so getting your uterus scanned, an ultrasound is incredibly beneficial for picking up things like endometriosis and more specifically blood tests for PCOS. Now, in the way of endometriosis and adenomyosis, I won't go too far into these chronic conditions and illnesses, and neither PCOS as well, because this is obviously not my area of expertise and certainly not within my scope. But do definitely pop into your GP if you're finding that you are getting particularly irregular cycles, particularly heavy cycles, painful cycles, and certainly symptoms that are pretty much unbearable in the way to live with, because they aren't a sign, that's a sign that you have something going on, that there is a problem, whether it be with your hormones, so that would be testing your bloods, whether it be with something that is more physical, and that might be something from an inflammatory perspective on the inside, so in your uterus or in your ovaries. Now, obviously, polycystic ovary syndrome is with regards to ovaries, and obviously endometriosis and adenomyosis is with regards to the endometrium and the myotrium parts of the uterus. There are lots of different issues and obviously conditions that can kind of extend off of those particular issues, and sometimes women can have more than one of them. What's important to remember though is that these can be sometimes very closely linked with the way that our body operates and what we are doing to our body as to what type of response we get from our menstrual cycle. And again, as I mentioned previously, that this is an indication that maybe we need to fix things up and look at things like even having deficiencies. So we could have certain vitamin and mineral deficiencies, which could be either not causing but certainly exacerbating some of the issues and symptoms that we're experiencing. So yes, definitely book in with your GP if you're having any sort of issues where your cycle is not semi-regular. As I mentioned, it is okay for it to differ a little bit between cycles. You're not going to get it every single 28 days. You're not going to get it consistently every 26 days. I know you have it marked in your calendar or whatever, but also look at tracking your cycle. I love the idea of tracking your cycle in any sort of tracking app. I just use the Apple Health app. It's free, it's not complicated, and certainly it allows me to track things like the symptoms that I experience in the lead up to my period, the symptoms I'm experiencing during my period, and also the length of my period, and it tells me the different duration between my cycles and the duration of each cycle. So that's a benefit to me because it's kind of like a diary for my period. Now, obviously, if you've been to your GP and you've got all that sussed out and you've got your bloods done and everything like that, sometimes you can come back with bloods that basically say there's nothing going wrong. I would certainly look at investigating as far as possible into your bloods, so looking at obviously testing your hormones, which go far above and beyond things like progesterone, estrogen, follicular stimulating hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, and estrogen. Now that's all the kind of typical, all of your typical cycle hormones, but then there's also the forgotten one, which is testosterone. So you can see already that, women kind of have these incredibly complicated types of hormones circulating, but men also do have, and it's important to remember, men do have some levels of estrogen and progesterone, and obviously testosterone as the major sex hormones. So sex hormones aren't just about sex. I discuss hormones obviously on a level as a practitioner and a nutritionist, as somebody who needs to be aware of them. And it is something that's often neglected as a coach. I think that especially coaching females, and I don't like to say it's that men coaching women or anything like that. I think that it just is any professional coaching a female needing to be fully aware of the impacts of over-exercise or just exercise in general, underfeeding, so not eating enough food and calories, and obviously low body fat percentages on athletes. Obviously in the other direction as well, looking at things like overeating and over-consuming calories, the effect of inflammatory foods and saturated fats, etc., on the menstrual cycle, and certainly on chronic conditions, and understanding how they can impact the cycle as well. So I'm going to dive into what happens to those who might be experiencing endometriosis or PCOS or some sort of chronic condition, and when they get these irregular cycles, what could be causing them. Maybe this is all speculative as well, because this can always be investigated further, and then obviously you would need to speak to a dietitian to dive a little bit deeper into maybe what you might need to do to adjust your diet to correlate with helping out with your chronic condition. But some people will find that they have particular foods that will cause more inflammatory responses around their cycle. And so this is why it's really important to be mindful of which foods that you respond quite well to and which ones maybe might be causing a little bit too much inflammation. Now, what I see most commonly is that a lot of women will basically say things like, I think I'm gluten intolerant, or I might be celiac, etc., because I really can't do wheat around the time of my cycle. It makes me really stuck. It makes me feel really bloated, etc. And this is where I would like to just pull them up a little bit on that, and maybe get them to reflect upon the idea that it might just be the amount of wheat that they're eating. And I've mentioned this in previous podcasts. So sometimes we need to listen to our bodies and possibly look at the idea that the bloating isn't just from our period and obviously being due for our period, but also looking at what food choices we are making. And are we shifting towards more whole foods? Are we having a lot of inflammatory foods, such as a lot of wheat and dairy around the time of our cycle? Is that impacting us? Is it another food that we're eating that we're not quite sure of? Some women don't respond very well to things like legumes around their cycle as well. So again, it's really important to consult with a dietitian, an endocrinologist, or a gynecologist, which is basically going to help you with specific issues branching off of these conditions. As a sports nutritionist, I do deal a little bit with some of these issues, but only very lightly, because I'm only qualified, insured, registered, and covered to do that. But more complex issues that go a little bit deeper into those chronic conditions, if you are diagnosed with PCOS, endometriosis, or adenomyosis, will be able to be taken care of by a practitioner, or certainly referred onwards to somebody that needs to take care of that for you. So, for those outside of chronic disease, now that I've obviously addressed that, and I would like to say as well that we do know that overconsumption of calories and in the way of gaining significant amounts of body fat can greatly throw off our hormonal balance. And this is where you will see a lot of people say things like, I have a hormone imbalance and that's why I can't lose body fat. But a lot of the time it's actually the other way around. So it's more a case of because we're over consuming calories, total calories, and also obviously sometimes high marked inflammatory foods. That's where you can see that it's not necessarily that the inflammatory foods are not allowing you to lose body fat, but certainly more calorie dense foods, which are causing you to gain a significant amount of body fat. And then in those cases, we can see that some women who have the higher percentages of body fat, or certainly are storing more body fat than their body would like, this will affect your cycle, your hormones, and things like your estrogen, your progesterone, your T3, etc. Other things that can affect your cycle include things like micronutrient deficiencies, which include things like iron, calcium, vitamin B, and the list goes on, zinc deficiencies, which can very easily lead to an irregular cycle or certainly more painful cycles. So, and then in the opposite direction as well, probably a topic that not a lot of people are talking about, but certainly that the effect of athletes training to an extent where it is quite intense, might be more, quite regular sessions, long sessions, big lifting sessions, and certainly reaching a percentage of body fat that is not favourable for the cycle to occur at a healthy level. This will be different from female to female, but generally we will see that a cycle will like to kick into gear around that 20% body fat and above mark. And then obviously on the opposite end of the scale, where you might see that somebody who is around 40% body fat, maybe 35 to 40% body fat, and you might see issues with the cycle again. So basically the nice, happy, sweet spot, some people do get a regular cycle when they're sitting around 15 to 18% body fat. It's not overly common, but you'll find that there is this influence on body fat percentage and how regular and obviously how painful your cycles are as well. So with the athletes that experience, obviously, as I mentioned, amenorrhea, the issues with that is because obviously after exercising, intense exercise for long periods of time, it actually induces a huge stress on the body and also can inhibit the production of the hormones required for your cycle to basically occur. So there's sometimes some missing links whereby you might not be ovulating, or whereby you may not be going through your luteal phase, or you may not have enough of a particular hormone to go through those phases, and this is where we can have those missing cycles. All I can say is if you are currently an athlete, is somebody who, and I would consider it to be somebody who's training around 5 to 6 days a week, maybe even 4 to 5 days a week. They are intensive sessions, weights-based sessions, cardio-based sessions, whatever it might be, anything kind of above half an hour per session. Let's say you've got, higher steps than the average person as well, or maybe you've only got moderate steps, but you're training intensively. Whether you're doing double sessions, which I don't recommend, especially for women, but certainly for men as well if you've been doing it for a long period of time. And then on top of that as well, if you have been dieting for a prolonged period of time, which will have a huge impact on your menstrual cycle, whether or not you get your menstrual cycle and whether or not you actually get those fluctuating and changing hormones. Now, we can see that the impact of long-term dieting and intensive exercise, obviously, we have this missing cycle in the case of somebody who is off birth control, and we can see that. And it's very difficult to test for. So when you go and get your blood tests done, if you are falling into this kind of category here, and even if you're falling into a category of someone with an irregular cycle, it is suggested to get your bloods done actually twice within the month of where your cycle should be. And it's generally around the days of 14 to 17 and days 28 roughly of your cycle. So in the middle of the month and the end of the month, basically. Very difficult to do, obviously, if you don't know where your menses is, if you're on birth control. You will get those, this is really important to remember, you will get some of your normal hormonal changes underneath the pill. So, and also the IUD and any sort of hormonal birth control. They just won't be as notable because you're not going to get your standard menstrual bleed. And when you do take your sugar pill and you get that withdrawal bleed, sometimes that's not actually synced or timed with your own hormones. So it can kind of be a little bit of a guessing game in that case. So yeah, if you do get your bloods done, just make sure you let your doctor know that you would like to get them done at 2 different phases of your cycle, because it's very important to do that. And sometimes it can be really important if you're having lots of issues and you can't get to the bottom of it, to get your bloods done every single week for 4 weeks in a row. And this can help give a really good snapshot of where you are across that 28 to 30 day period. Obviously, without that, if you just go and get your bloods done once off, they could test you to see where you are in your phase, and you could be in luteal, you could be in, where you've got high levels of progesterone, you could be in, technically in your menses where you've got very low levels of every hormone, or you could be in your follicular and ovulation phase, whereby obviously you are, more likely to get pregnant. And the hormones will test at different levels, obviously, at these different phases of your cycle. But obviously, if you have a cycle that is not quite right, some of these can be prolonged past the period where they actually should be, whereby you could test as normal, but it could be a little bit longer than what it's meant to be. So it's very important to get numerous tests done to get a better snapshot of where you are. Now that I've got that out of the way, because I really wanted to obviously address that first and just understand chronic conditions and diseases, and certainly the stuff that's really higher risk. If you have gone through menopause, you're going through menopause, I will touch on that briefly as well, but basically you're not going to have as much of a regular cycle, and you would liken this to going through a part of your life which should be treated as a disease, because that is what is happening. Every woman goes through it, but certainly it needs to be treated with care, just like you would a chronic condition or illness. In that case, obviously seeing a practitioner and looking at seeing someone who specialises in menopause and those stages of life. Obviously, we know what occurs, we get those hot flushes, etc. But there are obviously things that you can do to help out with those symptoms in the way of dietary guidelines and exercise. Most of the time, it is literally just improving our dietary choices to help out with reducing that inflammation, and certainly helping calm down those hormones, or certainly helping increase some of the hormones that you might need a little bit more of. And with regular exercise, menopause can be improved, the symptoms of. So, really important. I really can't stress this enough. If you have an irregular cycle, a painful cycle, if you think there is something not quite right, we know our bodies more than anybody. Please get to your GP and make sure that you get those referrals to the professionals that you need to, and certainly get in for blood tests and ultrasounds. They are mostly rebated by Medicare for women, so it's really important to understand that it's not going to be a huge out-of-pocket cost for you. So, moving on from there, let's talk a little bit about the cycle and obviously understanding it, because I would have thrown in some terms there you might not have understood entirely. Now, I want to obviously pop up on the screen here if you're watching on YouTube, and you can really, honestly, I know I hate saying this, but you can Google what the menstrual cycle looks like from a hormonal change perspective. But technically the start of a cycle is classified as your menses, okay? So this is where we see days 1 to maybe 6 or 7, where we start our bleed. We are shedding the uterine lining, and this is where we see that we basically get the cramps, we get the bleeding, we get all of the symptoms that come along with those pains that we get in our hips and our back. And so when we begin with menses, this is where we will see that most women are probably not going to want to exercise. They're going to have some trouble with their diet as well. And it really differs from person to person as to what that looks like. Some people find that they get more cravings when they are, due for their period, when they're kind of leading into their period. And some people find that they get stronger cravings when they're on their period. This is all entirely normal and different from individual to individual. So we have the start of the cycle, days 1 to 6 or 7, where we have our bleed. And in that phase, it's really important to understand that, as you can see with this diagram, that you actually have basically a hormonal flatline. And so this is where we have particularly low levels of estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone. So we don't really have much of anything going on hormonally for us. Now, this can sometimes for some people lead to some mood swings and issues on your period, but it's actually more common prior to your period. So when you're going through this phase, you don't have a lot of estrogen to protect your joints. And this is what's a really important hormone. Estrogen basically is quite magical. It can give you increased energy and certainly can help out with your serotonin production. Estrogen is fantastic, and it used to be really demonized, but now it's understood to be a hormone that can be very beneficial for women. But unfortunately, through menses, we don't have a lot of estrogen going on there. So if we look at things like our training and our nutrition, I'll discuss this a little bit later, we actually do need to adjust our training and nutrition just slightly, or certainly our awareness around it, because of those hormonal levels. Now, moving on from obviously our menstrual phase, and we go into what's called follicular Now, some people actually technically classify menses inclusive of follicular, so it's kind of like this umbrella. But I like to reference the next phase as your follicular phase, whereby you will obviously have this increase in estrogen. It kind of climbs up towards your ovulation. Okay, so this is where we get this nice increase in estrogen, and it's actually we know that after our period is finished, it's a wonderful feeling. We almost feel like a little bit more clear-minded, and we have just a much better time of life in general. Our skin seems to clear up, we have a better experience on pretty much everything nutrition, training-wise. Now, this phase generally goes anywhere from, sometimes for some people, maybe up to 10 days inclusive of ovulation, and even 14 days if you're really lucky. So whereby obviously towards the end of this phase we start to ovulate. Now, ovulation is the phase where we actually get a little bit of a drop in estrogen towards the end of ovulation. Ovulation only really lasts a couple of days, so these are the peak days that you can get pregnant. Not so much of a rule of thumb for everyone, you know, it really is very different. You know, sperm can really stay alive for quite some time. So getting pregnant can really, you know, if we try and do that whole birth control around your cycle thing, birth control in the sense of timing sexual intercourse around your cycle, it is something that people do practice. I can't recommend it as a practitioner because it can be a little bit risky, but obviously if you are not necessarily too fussed on conceiving or not conceiving, maybe that might be an interesting way of a contraceptive method. So, you know, just avoiding that ovulation and follicular window, so to speak. But obviously, as I mentioned, sperm can, you know, stay alive for quite some time. So there is a way that you can get pregnant outside of that ovulation phase. Now, your ovulation is quite short, okay? So we actually get that reduction in estrogen. And again, progesterone isn't particularly high around here. So I'll talk about progesterone in a second. But for now, we have this reduction in estrogen. Through this follicular phase to ovulation phase, we also have what's called a follicle-stimulating hormone, and then we have a luteinizing hormone as well. Now, basically, they're just two hormones that come about throughout the follicular phase. They are not present throughout the next phase, which is the luteal phase. So these two hormones, they just kind of hover around and stick around then. And they will be present, obviously, if you are testing for your bloods when you go through your follicular phase. When you get to ovulation, your estrogen drops a little bit just after ovulation or around ovulation. But you also get this interesting little spike of testosterone through ovulation as well. And this is where you see an increase in your libido. Okay, so some people will see an increase in their libido around the follicular phase, and some people will see an increase in libido around the ovulation phase specifically. Why? Because it's designed to help us get pregnant. Some people find their libido is unaffected throughout their entire cycle. It's important to understand that it's not the same for everybody. If you, though, however, find that in particular your libido has gone from being pretty high to then pretty low all of a sudden, or certainly maybe from low to really high for no reason, it's just important to get that checked out as well, because your libido is very closely related and interwoven with this entire process. You will find, though, your libido may obviously improve with introducing regular exercise and dietary changes as well. So it's so important to understand that, and stress levels, again, can impact your cycle and your libido. So it's that trifecta that seems to we always come back to: the nutrition, mental health, and obviously regular exercise. Sleep and water consumption will come in there as well. Obviously, lack of sleep can really affect our hormonal balance too. So it's important to remember that they actually all impact both our menstrual cycle, sure, but our actual regulation of other hormones that are incredibly important for our body to function at its best. So, not going off on a tangent, hopefully. So understanding that we basically, when we have this little spike of testosterone, I'll go back to the libido, we may have this increase in libido. Okay, so we have the menses, days 1 to 6 or 7. Okay, then we have technically the follicular phase, we'll call it, from, you know, days, well, it might be 7 onwards, all the way up until, you know, it could be even days 14 to 17. Okay, and so again, this is where we have a nice happy phase where we really enjoy our training and we have a better time with our nutrition as well. Most women will find that they don't have any sort of crazy cravings around the time of their follicular and ovulation, and no sort of hunger increases either. Now, let's talk about the asshole period of time called the luteal phase. Now, I don't know whether we're all familiar with luteal, but I seem to talk about it quite a lot in some podcasts and social media posts, but basically luteal phase comes right after ovulation. So it's quite interesting to see that we go through this roller coaster of emotions and we basically end up out the other end after we have this increase in libido and we're quite fertile, our fertile window, and then we actually go into our luteal phase. Now, we're not straight to arsehole, so it's not like we're, like that, Jekyll and Hyde type of situation, but I say arsehole because sometimes we can be an arsehole in our different parts of our cycle. But we do have that gradual increase of things like irritation. We are quite irritable. We need more sleep than usual. We actually need more sleep. It's not just that we want more sleep, we actually need more sleep than usual. And the way I look at this is that when we go through luteal, we need to treat ourselves with significant care. We also need to increase our water through that phase as well. So there's lots of different things that we need to do when we go through a luteal phase. Now the luteal phase can be from day 14 onwards up to day 28 or longer, right? Depending if your cycle is longer. Now, if you're unlucky, it'll be longer than you want it to be because this part of your cycle, we can't get out of it. We can't suppress it. We can't change it. And this is where we see that the lining of the uterus actually thickens in preparation for the next part again of your cycle, but actually for the egg to have somewhere nice to kind of plant itself, okay? And so basically the lining thickens in this preparation, but we require a hormone called progesterone. And this is where we get this, and you can see in the diagram, if you've had a look at it, this massive spike of progesterone, which basically looks like a roller coaster, just climbing up and up and up and up. Where we find that peak is where we are cranky, we are sore, we are tired, we are hungry, we are getting weird cravings, and the list goes on. Now, at this stage of your cycle, again, you'll know, okay? You also could experience symptoms like sore boobs, sore nipples, the list goes on. It's different from person to person. If you've had a particularly long period of time between, sorry, my cat's in the background deciding to attack the floor. I love that when it happens at a podcast. If you are experiencing, if you've had a long time between your cycles, you may be experiencing these particular symptoms more severely, okay? So it's important to understand that if it's been a long time and you're getting a lot of these symptoms and they're really yucky, probably because it's been a while and your body is just trying to figure it out, okay? And so then we go through this awful luteal phase, and this is why it's so important to track your cycle. If you find that you've got a reduced strength in the gym, you're not feeling as good about yourself, you will feel more bloated than usual, et cetera, and I'll talk about this again in another part of the podcast. What happens to our weight? What happens to, our fluid stores? And this is really important for women to know because this can actually really change your experience and your attitude towards the scale. We go through this phase, we feel awful, our training is really impacted, and tracking our cycle can actually help us because we have this foresight. We know we're going into luteal. We're like, yes, my strength is down. Yes, I'm tired. Yes, I'm cranky, I'm irritable, I'm getting weird cravings. Why am I hungry and I feel like nothing is, hitting the bottom of my stomach? It's just the strangest experience, and feeling bloated and feeling watery, and you might have had some definition that's completely disappeared or whatever it might be, or your pants might feel firmer and you're thinking, have I gained weight? Weird, I'm dieting. Or maybe you're not, maybe you're in maintenance. Maybe you are in a surplus and you've just spiked up in your weight. So this will all occur through luteal. And the interesting thing is that the timing is impeccable because it's pretty much just, everything is lumped on us all at once. So, and then obviously things in our life can feel a lot worse too. So this is where our mental health is probably at its worst, okay? This is where it's really important to focus on self-care. It's really, obviously in general it is, but really important when we go through this phase to take care of ourselves even more than we were prior. And so that's things like increasing certain vitamins and minerals into the diet. If you already had them in there, sure, but increasing them further. And I'll talk about that as well. But there are changes that we need to make throughout our cycle, okay? So we get to day 28, yeehaw! And all of a sudden we start cramping again, okay? And this is when we start to experience the symptoms of the start of, again, back to the day 1 of our cycle. I kind of look at my cycle in reverse. I look at the start of my cycle, weirdly enough, as my luteal phase, because I find that it's easier for me to relate to those changes as being the start of a new cycle, just because I know that then that's indicative of me then going into my menses. Okay, so personally, I like to classify the start of my cycle in a way as my luteal phase. But scientifically, this is what we have to experience. Now, we also do get a bit of a spike in estrogen, okay, along with the progesterone when we go through our luteal phase. Unfortunately, that nice little bit of estrogen is really just only to counteract the high levels of progesterone, which are very stressful on the body, as I've described, obviously. So if anything, the reason why we release a bit of estrogen is just to counteract some of that nasty progesterone hormone. It's a hormone that needs to occur, obviously, in order for us to build up that lining of our uterus. So now I've explained the cycle roughly. I haven't butchered it, I promise you. I'm sure there are practitioners that think that I might have not done as good of a job as I could have, but I do have enough knowledge. I've not made any notes on this podcast because I have enough knowledge of the female cycle to explain it, to explain the symptoms you might be experiencing, and certainly the red flags that you might need to address if you are having any sort of issues with your cycle. And I will go back to the idea that if you don't know what your cycle is like, if you are in a position to go off birth control just for a little bit to understand where it's at, it's not a bad idea. But again, I don't recommend it professionally because it is something that is individual for each person. And certainly I don't want to get anyone or put anyone at risk of falling pregnant if they did not want to in the first place. So birth control is fantastic, but unfortunately there are some side effects which include things like not understanding where we are in our cycle in correlation to our health. So obviously now I'm going to talk about how our cycle impacts our nutrition and training, okay? So I've talked about the different stages. So let's talk about menses and how it impacts our training and our nutrition. It's actually known that, and if I talk about luteal first, because that's the one towards the end of the cycle, but we know it's a cycle that leads back into menses. So let's talk about menses and luteal. So luteal obviously comes before menses if you were to have them kind of, going around each other in a circle like that. So your luteal phase, you're cranky, your progesterone's really high, you're hungrier than usual. There is actually a reason why you get these strange hunger cravings. And a lot of it is because we actually have a higher requirement for things like magnesium, zinc, and iron. And funnily enough, sodium around the time of our luteal phase. Now, it's a common misconception that we need to reduce our salt levels and we need to make sure we're not having as much salt around our period because it's really bad for us and bad for this and bad for cramping. Couldn't be more far from the truth. Sodium is incredible for, it's an electrolyte, it's 0 calorie. Yes, if we have more salt, we can hold more water, but it doesn't make you gain body fat. So if anything, I actually like increasing my sodium personally around the time of my cycle when I'm due because it just helps subside some of those cravings. Weirdly enough, if you just add a bit more table salt to your main meals, you may not crave as many of those salty foods. And it's not going to impact you unless you already have a pre-existing condition like high blood pressure, for example. If you're exercising regularly, your body's going to use that sodium, okay? If it doesn't and you store more water than usual, that's perfectly okay, but it will help out with things like some recovery and certainly helping you hydrate a little bit more than you were previously, because in luteal, we actually need more water than we usually drink, right? So we basically get a little bit dehydrated. Progesterone is a diuretic, okay? It does dehydrate you. And so this is where we see that, yes, we get a spike in hunger, but we're actually also more thirsty than usual. We just seem to miss the mark with it and think that it's just hunger. So generally, honestly, the recommendations can really vary, but you can increase your water anywhere from 500 mils to a litre depending on your activity levels. Your water intake will be different from person to person based on weight. Generally, it's recommended to be around 500 mil per 10 kilos of body weight, so 500 mil per 10 kilos of body weight. But again, depending on your lean tissue mass and depending on your muscle mass, that will obviously differ how much energy you're using, etc., and how much water you're losing during the day. So it's just not recommended to drink a large amount of water for no reason, anywhere between 6 and 9 litres, for example, unless you are literally, running marathons and, needing that water. Try not to, load water in. But you can increase, and you should increase around your luteal phase from what your standard water intake is. And most women are not drinking enough. So most women I probably find drink between 1 and 2 litres of water, and then they obviously introduce things like exercise in there, and then they go through their luteal phase and they're actually dehydrated, incredibly dehydrated, and they are missing at least 1 to 2 litres of water that they probably should be drinking, which obviously helps out with those hunger levels and helps out with the hydration process. Now, obviously, hydration is essential for your exercise performance, and this is why we should be rehydrating, because through luteal, we have this impact on our training, right? So we feel weaker than usual. Now, what we need to be doing with our training in our luteal phase is quite simply basically tapering back. So if you've ever heard of a deload week, if your coach is a good coach, they'll actually teach you how to do this yourself. You shouldn't become reliant on your coach to give you your deload week. And I don't like to say this, but it's true, because some coaches won't like me for saying it. You should not become reliant on your coach for giving you a deload week. It basically is anywhere between a 20 and 40% reduction of your current volume or lift output, you know. So basically you can reduce the amount of weight that you're lifting. It's probably smart to do that. So, you know, not looking to hit PBs, and you probably won't anyway, and maybe just increasing repetitions, or even in general, you can decrease repetitions if you're really fatigued, and you can decrease weight. Don't be worried about reducing your strength. If anything, it's just important to get some exercise and move around the time of your luteal phase. You can even drop back a training day. So you can actually reduce your training days from, say, 6 to 5 or 5 to 4. And this can help out with your fatigue. In your luteal phase, you also want to look at increasing your sleep. So women actually need 8 hours, and you might need 9 to 10 hours during your luteal phase. You'll find you'll have a much better time and be less irritable. Now, who wouldn't love to get 9 to 10 hours of sleep every day? We're all very busy individuals, but if you can get sleep-ins on the weekend and communicate to your partner, hey, guess what? I'll be less of an asshole if you let me sleep. Oh my gosh, how good would that be if we just were allowed to have more sleep? You know, kids, parents, family, commitments, etc. And, you know, partner commitments. I understand that sleep is always, you know, eludes us, but it is that care factor, the extra care factor we need to put in. Now, during the luteal phase, we also need to increase things like magnesium and zinc and iron, okay? Mainly because we have inhibited mineral absorption as it is. We don't really absorb very much in the way of our minerals around our cycle, and let alone for the rest of our, around the luteal and menses, let alone the rest of our cycle, because we have, as human beings, we have issues with mineral absorption. But increasing your magnesium, zinc and iron will help out with what basically you're going to lose a bit more of during your cycle, because it is quite taxing on the body. We lose a lot of magnesium because obviously we get dehydrated, we lose a lot of sodium. So it's important to replenish the magnesium and the sodium. And the zinc will help out with things like cramping, and obviously with immunity, because around the time of your luteal phase, you're also more likely to get sick. And the iron will help out with replenishing iron stores, which may be lost in the upcoming period, obviously because of the blood loss. And so some women will find they're iron deficient as it is. So generally when you are due for your period and when you're getting a period, this is where you need to pay even more attention to your iron levels. So obviously, I've talked about a few things you can do with your training, etc. With your nutrition, you're actually going to have, and this will differ from person to person again, but the hunger is explained by the lack of mineral absorption. So obviously we get cravings for things like chocolate, etc. We actually need, what we need from that chocolate is magnesium and zinc, okay? In the chocolate, there's very low levels of magnesium and zinc because it's mostly made of sugar. Okay, but that's why we want to eat a whole block of it. So what we can do, and I've given this recommendation to clients, is increase things like, or add things like cacao powder, which is CACAO powder. You can get it in the health food section. Add it to your yogurt, your smoothies, etc. Trust me, it will kick the chocolate craving. It's quite strong, only a teaspoon or so. And this will help out with basically increasing your levels of magnesium and zinc, and you'll find that you probably won't crave as much of those food items. So obviously we can't, necessarily eat lots and lots of red meat in that same breath as well around the time of our cycle. So the iron is a good one to supplement if you already have low iron stores, or find that you get particularly low iron around the time of your cycle. So as we move into that luteal phase, we actually sometimes get an increase in metabolic rate, whereby we actually burn more calories than we would in any other phase of our cycle. And then also leading into menses, this can also occur. But it doesn't actually occur across every single individual. In some cases, you might get a 1.5% increase in calorie expenditure for females, which is quite small. And then in other cases, you might have between 10 and even 20% of an increase, very rarely though. But this is basically an indication that unfortunately we really can't apply a rule of thumb for everybody. If you go through luteal, we can't say that you will burn more calories significantly enough to increase your calories. However, we can say that it is a good place to try and time things like diet breaks or refeeds for psychological reasons, obviously, if you are dieting. And if your coach is aware of where you are in your cycle, it's much easier to then time that quite wisely, certainly because you look at having diet breaks around the 6 to 8 week mark, and this can sometimes time really well along with your luteal and menses phase, where you might have a 7, 10, or even 14-day diet break, which might time across that luteal and menses for you naturally. So, but obviously it can be anywhere from 1 to 500 calories that we might require because we burn more energy, and this is partially where this increase in appetite comes from, other than obviously the craving for things like sodium, magnesium, and zinc. In these cases, I always recommend just increasing the amount of magnesium and zinc, maybe a bit more table salt as well in our meals. But you can do that by supplementing the purest version of magnesium and zinc. You can get it from a pharmacy and try and have that upper level of the dosage. So for women, it might be usually it's around 300 milligrams daily, but you might be able to increase that to 600 milligrams to supplement, because we do have a reduction in the absorption of minerals, as I mentioned previously. In general, we don't actually absorb as much as we should when we consume it, so that supplementation of magnesium and zinc can be quite crucial, and iron is the other one that you need to keep an eye out for. So what I do is I just go into what's called my period care. I take out my iron, my magnesium, and my zinc, the 3 separate supplements in the higher doses. And I actually then take them during my luteal phase, and then the start of my menses, or most of my menses. That can help out with things like your cramping, your pain. That's what the magnesium does, helps relax the muscles, especially your uterus, because there is muscle in there, okay, and all the muscles around your hips as well, and your back. And certainly your zinc is fantastic, as I mentioned previously, for protecting your immune function and things like helping out with your joint health as well, which can be impacted from that progesterone, because obviously high levels of progesterone during that luteal phase actually dries out the joints as well. So it's not just dehydrating you in general, making you feel more fatigued, etc., but you're actually then getting drier joints. And as the estrogen isn't quite enough to lubricate the joints around that time, that's when you're more injury prone as well. So, and then leading into menses, I would continue that care on. What you can look at doing is deloading as well, as I mentioned. So deloading through luteal and then through to menses. I wouldn't recommend doing it all the way through luteal and menses, because then you're deloading for most of your month. But what you could do is, start to deload when you can feel your strength really decreasing. And again, that's why I like to teach my clients how to mindfully do this with their own current training program. It looks like anywhere between 20 and 40% reduction in weights, or even reducing your reps, even reducing your training days, maybe from 6 to 5, etc. So when we look at doing that, you can do that all the way through to menses, maybe like the end of your luteal. So maybe you might look at doing this, the week leading into your cycle, your menstrual cycle, and then maybe days 1 to 3. A lot of people find day 4 onwards starts to improve. Myself, I find that it does improve because my estrogen is slowly increasing from there onwards. But because you flatline in hormones during your period, it's also a time where you might be more prone to injury. So try not to do anything that's kind of crazy flexible work around that time, and try not to test your PBs in the first few days of your period, because it can really put you at risk of injury. So when you move out of your menses and you're slowly moving into your ovulation, or your follicular, then your ovulation, you'll find that as soon as your period has ended, you will pretty much feel $1,000,000. Your estrogen will start to rise, and this is where you start to get lubrication of the joints from estrogen. It's a fantastic hormone. You also get increased serotonin production, so you will just feel happier than usual. And you also have things like the ability to properly absorb things like vitamin D, and also increased absorption of other vitamins and minerals. So estrogen's a fantastic hormone. It pairs nicely with some of the happy hormones that we actually release more of during that time. So again, this is where you want to do your strength training. You want to try and hit your PBs, and you really want to push harder with your lifts around this time. You're less injury prone, and you'll have a much better time in your life in general. You'll be in a better mood. You won't need as much sleep. You can probably taper your water down, obviously not a lot, but certainly you don't have to drink as much as you did when you were going through your luteal and menses. And so then obviously now we know that the follicular, I'll call it follicular because I like to separate that from menses, but follicular ovulation, again, it can be anywhere from, that whole period can be anywhere from 8 to 14 days long if you're lucky. So it can be quite a long period of time, but you'll know when you're coming out of that as you start to get a bit more irritable and you go back into your luteal and you start to feel a little bit more watery, etc. Now, some coaches will actually say to you, look, maybe you need to do different types of exercise for each week. If you're a lifestyle client, sure. If you don't have any sort of specific aesthetic goals and you just want to train for health, I don't see any issue with that because obviously then you can just look at simply just training for your cycle. So that would honestly look like for your menstrual cycle, you don't want to be doing any sort of yoga or stretching or anything that involves where you might be too limber because you actually soften up too much around your period, and that can, again, look at seeing that you get, you're more injury prone. So you would do things like circuit training, maybe for the week of your period. This is just something that I don't necessarily program or recommend, but you can do it if you want to. Then you go into your strength training in your your follicular and ovulation phase, where you're doing mostly weights. And then you would go back into luteal, where you would do yoga and walks and things that are very low intensity, and maybe taper back your training days as well. So again, this doesn't have to be super technical. It is something that you can do, but I don't suggest it for bodybuilders or athletes that obviously need to train in their area with their sport, because they need to progress from week to week. You're not going to see huge progression. It's an important thing to understand is that, from things like your menses to ovulation, yes, you're going to start to see increases in weights. You're going to hit PBs, you're going to go, wow. And then you might actually go back through, when you go through luteal, you might see a strength reduction slowly. And so a lot of clients can get really disheartened because they think they're losing strength or losing muscle. And actually, when you get things like in-body scans done, you can record a lower muscle mass along the time of when you're due for your period and when you're on your period, just literally because of how it affects the scanner. And you can often record a higher body fat percentage as well, even if you don't have more body fat. And I'll come into that for this next and last segment of this podcast. So the final part of this podcast, which is probably going to be the most important part of the podcast, is talking about weight fluctuations across our cycle, okay? And this is what will probably change your life. If you're listening to this podcast, I want you to share this with as many women as you can and tell them, hey, listen to the last part. It talks about weight, and it talks about why you shouldn't be obsessed with your weight going up and down across the month. So if you think about this cycle again, obviously looking at it from a perspective of 28 days as a unicorn cycle, if we look at what actually happens, and let's say I actually use luteal as the start of the cycle. I know that, again, practitioners use menses as a start, but I like to use luteal. So if you see luteal, what happens is, have you ever stepped on the scale? Maybe from one day to the next, it can be that quick, or even it can be gradual. But have you ever stepped on the scale through a fat loss phase, or maybe just in general life, and you've done nothing wrong? You haven't eaten any crazy foods. It's not like you've binged. It's not like you changed what you've been doing. You've been doing the same thing. You have been tracking your macros. You have been on point with your meal plan, whatever it might look like. You've been eating really well. In fact, you might even be hungrier than usual. And then all of a sudden you step on the scale, and from one day to the next, you've gained 2 kilos, 2.5 kilos, even 3 kilos in some cases. It's really important to understand that this can directly, in fact, it does correctly correlate to most of the time a fluctuation in your hormones. Now, this obviously then correlates to fluid. So we actually have an increase in fluid retention around the time of our luteal phase, and it actually can either gradually increase or just literally spike up, okay? I myself get around a 1.5 to 2 kilo increase on the scale, which actually has no influence from my food, has no influence from my training, nothing at all, other than the simple fact that if you think about it, when the uterine wall needs to build up and get thicker, what do you think is required to do that? Yep, you guessed it, it's fluid. Another impact of high progesterone is going to be the increase in fluid retention underneath our skin, okay? So basically it sits a little bit, just a little bit on top of the muscle, whereby we actually see this kind of like, it's a fluffy feeling, isn't it? It's like if you had abdominals and the definition in your tummy, it's gone now. And this usually happens right when we get that peak in progesterone, and basically we're like, holy shit, everything I've been working hard for is gone. We get this panic feeling of, oh my God, how did I gain 1.5, 2, 3 kilos in a day? And if you haven't been binging, if you haven't been eating excess amount of, crazy calories and things like that, and, it can be explained. It's actually explained because of this hormonal change. If you do start to track your cycle, you can be more aware of these fluid fluctuations when they come. And this can help you actually figure out whether or not you've dropped body fat, whether you stay the same for body fat percentage wise or roughly, or whether or not you've actually increased in body fat, okay? Generally, if you're seeing something like a 5 or 6 kilo increase when you're due for your period, so when you're going to that luteal phase and you've increased by 5 to 6 kilos, you're going to want to bet you may have increased some body fat. There are very rare cases where some women do gain 5 or 6 kilos of fluid, but this is usually if they suffer with a chronic condition. So if you've gained anywhere between 1 and 3 kilos on the scale overnight, there are obviously many reasons other than your hormonal changes which can contribute. Lots of fiber in your stomach. You may not have gone to the toilet properly in a few days. You may have had a poor night's sleep. You may be really stressed, etc., etc. You may be wearing all of your clothes. You may have eaten breakfast, and that might then obviously have contributed towards your weight because food and water weighs something. So if you then obviously have this scale weight increase, it's important to understand that if you're in a calorie deficit and you are gradually losing body fat and obviously weight on the scale, let's say you're increasing muscle as well at the same time. So we're losing body fat, we're increasing muscle, and it might look like the scale doesn't change a lot because obviously muscle has to weigh something. Also, all of a sudden we're cruising along, we're seeing changes in our physique, and then all of a sudden we have this weight spike. Now, what can be really confusing for practitioners and coaches is figuring out what the hell is going on and whether or not this little spike is obviously a luteal spike or whether or not it is a spike that is something to be concerned about. This is why it's so important to be very transparent with your coach about what you've done for the week or the fortnight or the day prior to your weigh-in, and certainly understanding that weight isn't something that we need to use as females as a clear indication of our progress all the way through our cycle. When your coach is understanding and knows about this increase and knows in your cycle where you are and goes, okay, cool, you know, you may not have increased, you may have stayed the same weight. This is an interesting one as well. You may have stayed the same weight from one check-in to the next, okay? And you might think, why has it been 2 weeks and I haven't dropped body fat? I'm as hungry as, or maybe weight, you're assuming it's body fat. I'm hungrier than ever, you know, I saw abdominal definition, now it's going away. What's going on? My calories aren't, you know, they're not high. I haven't increased my food. I'm still in a calorie deficit. What is happening? Generally, if you're in your luteal phase and you're due for your period, that would have usually have meant an increase in fluid. If your weight was, let's say, if you dropped no body fat at all and you'd plateaued, the fluid increase would then see your weight go up, okay? If you stayed the same weight technically without the fluid. So let's say no body fat dropped, your weight would probably go up, okay? And so in that case, you know, yep, I probably plateaued. I might need a diet break, chat to your coach and go, wow, I've gone up by 2 or 3 kilos, you know, is that normal? Especially in a fat loss phase, right? If you've stayed the same weight or you've only increased by a little bit, you know, maybe you've gone up by 500 grams, maybe you've gone up by maybe just, you know, a kilo or something like that, it's really important to take that into consideration. If you stayed the same weight and you go through a luteal phase, which is an undeniable fluid increase we cannot get around. If you had these regular increases, you're going to continue to have them. So what happens is if you stay the same weight, if you think about it mathematically, if you gain 1.5 to 3 kilos of fluid during your luteal and you stayed the same weight from one fortnight to the next, even going into your luteal, you've actually, if you think about it, +2, and then obviously then you would have to then minus it because you've got to take that fluid away. So if you stayed the same weight, you'd have to take away the fluid weight that you actually have gained to figure out what you actually weigh. Now that sounds really confusing. But I look at it this way. If my client is in a calorie deficit and they stay the same weight across, you know, it might be a 2-week or a 3-week period, right? And they had some big drops prior to that. I take into consideration whether or not their strength has gone up, whether they've increased their weights in the gym and they may have gained some muscle, some lean muscle tissue. But also obviously considering where they are in their cycle. And this has often led to me being able to practice quite safely and soundly with clients, understanding you're due for your period, especially if I'm keeping a track of where they had their life cycle and obviously when they were due in the previous month. And if I can see that that kind of lines up with where their cycle usually is, I then understand that, cool, one of the reasons why we may not have dropped and why we've stayed exactly the same weight or had a little bit of an increase is because we have dropped body fat, we've just gained some fluid, okay? We can't get rid of the fluid. We can't just drop your calories and, you know, the fluid goes away. Fluid is fluid and body fat is body fat. They're very separate things. So we have this fluid increase. When women understand fluid increases, they actually then stop getting triggered by these fluid increases every single month that happen without fail before menopause. And so then women can understand, cool, if my weight goes up slightly or stays the same, I'm actually in a pretty safe zone. I haven't gained body fat, and if it happens every single month around the same time, right before my period, that, you know, 7 to 14 days before my period, I know to track it. I know that that's not a problem. I know I will feel a bit fluffier than usual. I'm gonna have a bit more fluid, but it will subside. It will go away. okay? It's an important thing to remember, the fluid does drop out. As your period comes on, it starts to drop out. The bloating starts to reduce a little bit too, depending on how you're going with your diet and those inflammatory foods. And then we do start to see, and obviously increasing your water intake, and we do start to see that slowly but surely as your period finishes. I usually recommend 2 days after your period finishes to have what's called a true weight. And usually that is an indication if you have gone to the toilet, if you're not wearing any clothes, in the morning fasted, that's a true indication of what you actually weigh. And so I always ask my women to always compare, their current weight from where they were in their last cycle at the same point, right? So it's like if you're in luteal, only compare from your last luteal phase in your last cycle, and that will often give you the actual difference between, weights between those two pieces of data. And the same goes for your menses, and the same goes for your ovulation. And so I like to always measure my body weight 2 days post-period each month, because that kind of gives me an idea of exactly where I probably am sitting from a true weight and composition perspective. And the same goes for in-body scans. I always get scans, any sort of scan at all, as soon as my period has finished, a couple of days after my period's finished, for a much more accurate representation of my body composition. So I think, other than obviously mentioning the different things we can do for nutrition, I don't want to go into great detail with that, because that's more in the dietary side of things, and for dietitians in the way of chronic disease and inflammation, it's going to be very individualistic, so I can't give those recommendations. But what I will say is that every woman is incredibly different with their cycle, the length of their cycle, the symptoms, etc. And we all kind of do feel each other's pains to a certain extent. It's really important to discuss this with as many women as you can in the allied health field, and those who really like to specialize in these areas. And it's been something that I think over time I've really grown more passionate about, to understand, because it does have a huge influence on the way that we treat ourselves, the way that we see the world around us as well, the way that we respond to things, and so that we don't end up disappointed, disheartened, and certainly looking at scale weight obsessions, which may have triggered us in the past into even things like binge eating cycles as a result of those weight spikes, which basically are incredibly harmless across your cycle. So that's about it from me. If you do have any other very specific questions regarding your menstrual cycle, and certainly even regarding things like how to train around your menstrual cycle, your nutrition requirements around your menstrual cycle, please feel free to send me a message. I'm more than happy to chat about this with non-clients and current clients. I think that it's a topic of discussion that we need to really get out there. But what I would say is I do encourage those who are having trouble getting to the gym when they are on their periods, please just make sure that you get in there and try and give it a good red hot shot. Don't feel like you have to hit PBs. Please be kinder to yourself, knowing that we really do go through such huge fluctuations over the course of our cycle and month, and certainly across the time of our entire menstrual cycle, from puberty all the way through to menopause. And obviously I will do another podcast / vlog on male hormones, because obviously, interestingly enough, people assume men don't have a cycle. They do. Theirs is just 24 hours versus our lovely 28 to 30 something days. And certainly with men, there is obviously, some really untouched subjects with regards to testosterone levels, and certainly some topics that I need to really discuss with regards to male performance and what can lead to low testosterone, and then obviously the impacts of that on things like your training, nutrition, and mindset. So please stay tuned for that podcast. I want to do a separate one. This one has gone a lot longer than I wanted it to, but certainly I did cover quite a lot. So I'm hoping that you really took a lot away from it. And as I mentioned, please share this with at least 5 other women that you know, because I can guarantee it's going to help them if it helped you. Thanks a lot. Looking forward to doing another vlog and podcast for you soon. Okay, bye.